Hello, and welcome to the Kathleen Spracklin podcast. I am a woman on a mission to assemble a cadre of writers, thinkers, and teachers who are transforming the world one character at a time. And it all starts with one thing, a deep understanding of human motivation, why people do what they do, and the forces that drive them. This is episode number 18, Taxonomy of the Character Traits. Yesterday, we talked about the classification of Peterson and Seligman in their epic work, Character Traits and Virtues, where they make a distinction between virtues and character strengths. I took that apart a little bit and showed through logic why, in fact, even using their words, character traits are synonymous with virtues. And I chose character traits deliberately because character strength is unidimensional, and we need to talk about both dimensions, strengths and weaknesses, if we're really going to talk about virtue, because virtue does not exist independently of vice. So once we nailed it down to the point where we really aren't looking at two different things, we're really talking about one thing, now we can talk about where do we go with that definition? What is a virtue? What's the definition of a virtue? Is a virtue atomic, or is it composed of other smaller pieces? Are there dimensions to a virtue? Is it a thing that you have it or you don't have it? Are there degrees? What constitutes its dimensionality? And then a little bit about aggregation. Are there bigger virtues and little virtues? Do big virtues contain little virtues? How does the taxonomy function to put the virtues together? Well, we'll never get through all of it in one short podcast, 10 minutes or under. So let's begin at the beginning, and we'll do an overview of each of those four things, which is about all we can really do for one brief podcast. First of all, a definition. I'm not going to go deep into the definition right now. I want to put a pin in that one and come back to it, because I think for starters, we can go with what Peterson and Seligman were using, which is that those attributes which philosophers and religious thinkers throughout the centuries have praised, and the things that constitute basically being what we would say is a good person. I'm going to leave it just as nebulous as that for the moment, because later on, when we have the taxonomy nailed down, we can come back around and come up with a more precise definition. But right now, just the general idea of, I pretty much know what a virtue is, will work well enough to get us going. So, are virtues atomic things in that they are indivisible, or are virtues made up of smaller components? I assert that virtues are made up of smaller components, and in fact, a virtue consists of three components. A virtue consists of three elements, three different emotions. I call it the triad of emotions. The nature of a virtue is that if you're going to make a choice between good and evil, then there's a struggle. There's an inherent struggle. Are you going to choose good? Are you going to choose evil? This is stereotypically represented as the good angel and the bad angel, which one is sitting on which shoulder, and this one whispers in this ear and that one whispers in that ear, and what is my choice going to be? So we know at the root of triviality that there is a struggle involved with virtue. Are you going to make the virtuous choice or the less virtuous choice? And if there's a struggle and a decision to be made, then there are obviously two other elements. The elements where the choice is made towards virtue, which we'll arbitrarily call victory. This is just vocabulary now. And the choice that we leads away from virtue, which I will call loss. Again, these are vocabulary words here. But if you think of the way that they're defined, if you define it as they have been defined through the centuries, then the choice for virtue is going to lead to good feelings, it's going to lead to order, it's going to lead to a more stable life, whereas the choice on the loss side is going to lead to feelings of regret, sorrow, and more chaos in life. So every emotion, every character trait has those three emotions that are intrinsic to it, the triad of emotions. So no, a character trait is not atomic. And when we go down deeper into it, when we dive deeper into the struggle itself, we will find that there are other elements there too. There are things that are modifiers that affect the struggle and modify the struggle, and there are elements of agency. To what extent is the person capable of making choices in one direction or another? So let's pause there and continue. Say this is enough of an overview for today on that one. Now let's talk about the dimensionality of virtue. This signpost vice versus virtue might be what you would automatically believe to be all there is to say about the axis of the dimensionality, the axis on which it's measured. And to a degree, that's absolutely true. If you only look at the positive side, you're only looking at half the picture. It's like having the natural numbers without having the negative numbers, so you don't have the integers. You can't even do subtraction. It limits you way too much if you ignore this side and only go with this side. However, this is an oversimplification of the dimensionality that is involved in the character traits. So let's take a quick overview, and it will have to be fast. We'll go into it more in the future. But this is a true representation of the dimensionality of the character traits. These are the various zones of awareness. The most central zone of awareness, the one that's called the zone of awareness right here, involves what I call the rudder traits. The rudder traits are the character traits which are within the individual's capacity to make decisions for the moment. We're not going to be able to go too deep into the rest of these, but very briefly, as you go up to the wing traits and the pinnacle traits, these traits are out of the grasp of the individual. Whereas if you go down the scale, the stability and the being, these are the traits that are basic to the individual. So he's not thinking about them all the time because these kinds of behaviors are automatic. We'll spend a lot of time on this as time goes by. But I'd like to make at least a brief mention of aggregation, because as it's very well known that the virtues are often broken up into 4 categories, and if we stick with character traits and we stick with a more secular vocabulary, and I have nothing against virtues, as a practicing Catholic myself, I value those terms very much, but I want to keep it secular because my focus is fiction writing. And so in the fiction writing group, and I have Dr. Karen Vila to thank for this grouping. I put the chart together, but I have her to thank for the grouping, that we have 4 major groups. They correspond to the taxonomy of Thomas Aquinas with the 4 virtues, and we will again spend quite a bit of time talking about why these groups are aggregated the way they are, and because they're going to be a very important part of taxonomy. So that's it. That's the brief overview of where we're going with the taxonomy of the character traits. Thank you. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.